I know, but someone else will want to do it. No, we'll just have an awkward moment of silence. This is the awkward moment of silence. You can earn stars. There are probably stickers. Who will be the note taker? Who is volunteering to take notes? Shane is taking notes, except for the part where Shane will be speaking. So hopefully DKG will be there then. That's great. Oh, and here he is, the note taker. Yeah. So there are blue sheets in the front. Unfortunately, this time we have a bit of a degradation of functionality because we don't have a board to write on. But I'm sure you all got tables or a book that you can write on. Please fill out the blue sheets. And then, since it's now 15:51 here in UTC 2+2 on the dot, I'd like to welcome you all to the. Ooh, that's the wrong window. To the Human Rights Protocol Considerations session in research group session in the IRTF. I am one of the co-chairs. I am Niels ten Hoever. I'm co-chairing this with Avri Doria, who, as you can see, is not here. If you would like to get involved, please have a look at the mailing list. Pull requests at GitHub, always very much requested. Meet Echo is here. Minute taking is taking place on the Etherpads. Please support DKG wherever possible. And if you'd like to know more about the work, or see the film we produced, or have a bit more background, you can have a look at our introduction website, hrpc.io. We have the Jabber scribes, we have the note takers. Now for the agenda bashing. This is the proposed agenda. We will do a short introduction, the status of the research group, context of the research. Then we go off to 3 really quite interesting presentations by Laura Denardis, David Kay, and Alyssa Cooper. Then we'll discuss the research group draft. We'll have then also the experiences in using the guidelines in the research group draft presented by Shane and Giovanni. And then we'll discuss, have an open discussion, next steps, and any other business. Would anyone like to add, remove, or suggest anything else for the agenda? No? Great. So that was the agenda bashing. Oh.
I'm not sure if it might work, but the Etherpad is not working, so, or I can't connect it, so I'm going to let you know locally unless somebody has other information.
Okay, so DKG is taking notes locally, and if someone wants to get the Etherpad to work to take joint notes, please put it in the Jabber or communicate it to DKG in any other way. Thanks so much. And there are some audio issues with that mic. Is the mic in the back working, perhaps, so we can use that one? That works, so they'll be exchanged. Thanks so much for that logistic support. So this is the note well. Please note well. If you haven't seen this yet, it's very useful to have a bit of a closer look at RFC 5378 and RFC 3973. And this is a new experiment that we were asked to add to our slides, and to reiterate the importance that people review the research group and working group documents, and not only the ones in your own working groups and research groups, but also at least in some other working groups and research groups, so we really can keep on producing high quality documents, and it will also help your documents get reviewed. So here we are at the status of the research group. We've been meeting now for quite a while, since we first presented in November 2014 during SAG. We've been a proposed research group for a year. We've been chartered, and this is now our second session as full research group. In IETF 95, so the previous time, we started inviting speakers that are not necessarily directly presenting on drafts, but also help us gain a broader understanding of the impact of human rights on protocols. And since it was quite a success last time, we chose to go ahead this time and managed to find quite some interesting speakers. The context and objective of the research group is to find a relation between internet protocols and standards and human rights, since the internet is often seen as an enabling environment for human rights, and after Snowden also an adversely impacting environment for human rights. We're trying to see how that relates to protocols and standards, and to formalize that relationship, and once we've done that, propose guidelines to protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment in future protocol development. And while doing that, also increase the awareness in both human rights community and the technical community about the importance of both technology and human rights. So it cuts both ways. We are not, luckily, the first ones to recognize that technology is not neutral. There have been several RFCs in which it has been stated that there are inherent values in the network, and an example of that is here is RFC 3935, where it says that the internet isn't value neutral, and neither is the IETF. So we're trying to make that relation more explicit and see if we can come up with documentation and research to support that. And we have been inspired in the work in our draft and in our research and also in our film by the work of Laura Denardis, who is a prominent internet governance scholar and who is teaching at the professor in School of Communications at American University, who's a senior fellow at SIGI, and who is also a director of research for the Global Commission on Internet Governance, who will now give us a talk of 10 minutes with 5 minutes of Q&A. Laura, can you put yourself there? Laura is in the queue, and I'm gonna press this big red button and see if there is some success. Nope. Let me push the button again. There. Hi, Laura.
Hello there. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just turn my volume down because there's quite an echo. Okay, let me know if you have any trouble hearing me. But good afternoon. Hi, Niels. Hi, DKG. Hi, Eric. Hi, everyone. I see the audience there. I wish I could join you in Berlin, but hello from Washington, D.C. The title of my brief remarks today is Emerging Issues in Protocols and Human Rights. I did provide some slides, and Niels, if you have access to that, it would be great to project that. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do in my brief time is to address some of the global tensions around internet infrastructure and how these raise public policy concerns for protocols. The conceptual starting point of my remarks, as well as for my research and my books and my teaching, is always that arrangements of technical architecture are also arrangements of power. This comes first from my background in engineering, information engineering, including degrees specializing in applied mathematical programming. I never thought that I would live in the world of words and not in the world of math, but I do have an engineering background and years of professional practice. Now, in doing this work, including security clearance work for the United States Department of Defense, I learned fairly quickly that the technical is political, affecting accessibility, civil liberties, innovation, and really access to knowledge. And then my other background is in science and technology studies, which examines how culture and politics shape technical design. And I've, as some of you know, I also spent 5 years at Yale Law School. So I say this because my lens into this, as many people who look at these issues, is interdisciplinary. It's an interdisciplinary mashup of engineering, policy, and law. Flipping to the next slide, Niels. My own doctoral dissertation advisor, historian of technology, Janet Abate, in her 1999 book, Inventing the Internet, actually wrote, protocols are politics by other means, and I often quote that in my work. Now, this statement really shouldn't at all be controversial, considering the many examples of policies that are embedded in standards, or considering the acknowledgement of the embedded values in design by leading internet institutions, or considering the heightened concerns that many of us have about how these designs could be changed to reflect more repressive information approaches rather than approaches that are geared towards openness and interoperability. But they do have public implications in their design, in their implementation, and their use. I've written a couple of books about this, but some examples that jump to mind right now, certainly encryption protocols and how they mediate conflicting values of privacy versus national security and law enforcement objectives, for example. A protocol like BitTorrent serves a very straightforward technical function of providing peer-to-peer file sharing, but that, of course, is intractably wrapped up in conflicts over piracy and how that's implemented and used. And other standards, such as the World Wide Web Consortium standards on accessibility, are geared towards expanding access for the disabled. So features like privacy and accessibility don't just happen. They're designed into technology and shaped by certain values. And if you would turn to the next slide, Niels. I like the Internet Society's description of this, the internet invariants. The question is, what are the enduring technical principles that have shaped how the internet has been designed and administered? So these include things like global reach, which is the potential of any device to reach any other device, regardless of location. It includes interoperability, permissionless innovation, accessibility, general support of any application, collaboration among stakeholders, mutual agreement, and my favorite, the principle of no permanent favorites. So these, while imperfect and themselves always marked by conflicting interests, these norms are understood to have contributed to the internet's growth and its architectural capacity for open innovation and expression. Next slide, Niels, thank you. So if one believes, as I do, that protocols sometimes have social implications, then obviously the procedures by which they're established are a fundamental governance concern related to expertise, public accountability, and the legitimacy really of communities of people in directly establishing public policy or things that bear on public policy. Openness is a key element to this. An organization like the IETF has a very high degree of procedural openness, obviously, and here I am remotely dialing in from DC, so that's evidence of that. But many standards organizations do not have the same kind of openness, and there are different kinds of openness in different environments. There's openness in development, which speaks to participation and transparency, openness in implementation, which means that standards are made publicly available and with minimal intellectual property rights restrictions, or with them made available on a reasonable and non-discriminatory basis. And of course, openness in use, which really just means that there is the potential for multiple competing products that are assured to interoperate. So getting at the permissionless innovation and the no permanent favorites characteristics. Next slide. But it's also important to remember that, or rather to not overstate the power of technical design in shaping human rights. There are many other broader factors that create interfaces between human rights and protocols. There are laws. Culture even affects participation. I was looking at some of the mailing lists around this meeting. So if a meeting is held, for example, in a place that criminalizes gay people, that is a barrier to participation. If someone uses a term graybeard, even in the context of the very open IETF, that constructs a real message about who's considered an expert and who isn't considered an expert. So there are cultural factors, even in institutions, not just in the different kinds of cultural norms of morality and content control around the world. Language is obviously a factor, and the policy-making role of private intermediaries, decisions about how to implement a standard, and of course, all of the market forces around this. So there really are quite a number of characteristics outside of the technical design characteristic. Now, with that in mind, I want to raise the question of what are some emerging phenomena at the intersection of infrastructure and human rights, and how could those potentially intersect with protocol issues? Next slide. Earlier this year, I published a new book. It's called The Turn to Infrastructure in Internet Governance, and it addresses the rising phenomenon of governments co-opting and even tampering with internet infrastructure for political and economic purposes. And of course, there's a very long history of this. We had the Egyptian government turning to infrastructure to cut off services. We've seen many cases of governments using things like denial of service attacks to disrupt alternative and dissident media. We've seen the use of infrastructure choke points to cut off access due to piracy. So there's a history here. But what we suggest in this book is that we need to extend the concept of governance by infrastructure to the phenomenon of governance by tampering with infrastructure. In other words, imposing things like statutory or technical or other requirements to actually modify the design of internet technical architecture for purposes that are really completely extraneous to keeping the internet functional. I jotted down a few examples that jumped to mind on this slide. Data localization laws, encryption backdoors, increasing interest in the domain name system. We're seeing even locally redirecting DNS queries. That's been happening for a while, but escalating, whether for content control or interest in intellectual property rights enforcement. So we call this tampering with the infrastructure. And it really constitutes a new set of increasing entanglements between power and the infrastructure of the internet. Now, all of these examples involve these attempts to modify the infrastructure to achieve things having nothing to do with keeping the internet operational. They all raise a variety of questions about human rights. They raise questions about whether the internet will continue to grow towards a universal internet, or using the term that's often used, fragment into bordered internets. And they all have implications for cybersecurity and therefore for human security. So the one suggestion I would make for this panel and for future research and future discussions is that this question of acknowledging, or really just the description of acknowledging that infrastructure is increasingly becoming a proxy for state power, it leads to the question of the extent to which this co-opting could extend government interest in core internet protocols, and then how that could affect efficiency, how it could affect innovation, and how it could affect human rights. I'll raise one more topic for the panel. If you'll turn to the next slide, please, Niels. And this is the phenomenon that, and I'm sorry, I see the slides are a bit skewed there, but hopefully you can read it. It's the phenomenon that the internet is no longer just a communication network. It's also a control network in which more objects are connected than people. And if we're moving from a world in which content is mediated into a world in which all of life is mediated, whether industrial control systems, home alarm systems, energy system sensors, cars, drones, surveillance systems, wireless heart monitors, things that involve biometric identification, it raises the question of the standards underneath these, who is setting them, whether there is a resurgence of proprietary networks, and what are the prospects for human rights in this context of increasing complexity and increasing pervasive networking into the real objects of life. It means that internet freedom and human rights are no longer just about content, but about other aspects of real world interactions. So fundamental human rights depend on the underlying infrastructure. I think that key research areas, I use the term research because I am a researcher, but I really just mean to say that key areas where these questions exist are things like digital currencies, augmented reality. Everybody is here in Washington playing Pokemon Go. You can't go anywhere in Washington without seeing people doing that. And gaming, areas of cyber conflict, digital archiving of material objects and virtual objects, and most importantly, the Internet of Things, or if you want to call it the Internet of Self. These all have significant implications for human rights. Many are at the borders of traditional Internet governance institutions, and therefore may not have the same kinds of traditional norms of openness and interoperability that can be seen in the more the traditional internet protocols and content-related standards. So because of this, and because all of these areas could involve a resurgence of proprietary standards where we can't even look and see what's happening and be able to analyze the human rights implications, I think it's very important that this panel is occurring. I've been watching the efforts of this initiative and appreciating it from afar. And I'm very delighted to be participating today. So I think it is the right time to address the prospects for human rights, not only for established internet protocols and what I would call content-centric systems, but to anticipate the types of human rights challenges in these new contexts at this early stage, rather than addressing them after the fact 5 years from now. So thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today, and I very much look forward to your comments and to the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that great presentation. So I'm not the only one who appreciated that. That's real nice. Is there a queue? That question always starts a queue. It's beautiful. Could you please state your name and start your question?
Dr. Denardis, my name is Elliot Lear. I'm with Cisco Systems. I have a question. You have been involved in a substantial amount of writing about internet governance. Obviously, your talk refers to that. When we talk about internet governance, I think in international fora, what we end up doing is we try to split the conversation of governance of the infrastructure versus governance of the people. Is that a meaningful distinction?
I think that is a meaningful distinction among many different kinds of distinctions. You know, I intentionally, in not my last book, but the one before it, The Global War for Internet Governance, I called the first chapter the Internet Governance Oxymoron, because there are so many contradictions inherent in this. But I just think about Internet governance as the administration and coordination of the design of the technologies that are necessary to keep the internet operational, and then the enactment of substantive policy around that. So I don't see, you know, just in my world of how I study this, I don't see it as like e-governance or things that governments do, but I do see it as the enactment of policy around the infrastructures of the internet, and especially how that affects public policy.
Hi, this is Corinne Kat from the Oxford Internet Institute in Article 19. I had a question, seeing as you've written extensively about especially internet governance and sort of the co-optation of the infrastructure. I was wondering if you could give some examples of other bodies where you've seen especially human rights issues like the ones we've been discussing here come up, and what kind of solutions you've seen them adopt to be able to deal with this new reality.
Well, I think where we're seeing the most problems at the intersection of human rights and infrastructure is what governments are doing. I think that's where the most attention needs to be placed right now. So, for example, it's interesting that you asked that, because I just published a paper just came out through the Global Commission on Internet Governance last night called One Internet, an evidentiary basis for policy making around internet fragmentation and universality. It's on the ourinternet.org website. And it talks about things like data localization. When you look at what governments are doing to try to put up borders around the internet, I think that is where the most problems are. So data localization, the turn to the domain name system, the turn to cybersecurity systems. Here in the United States, a lot of discussion about encryption strength, and not just within the infrastructure, but at the end devices. So I think that's the first area. I also think that attention should be placed to the kinds of standard setting institutions where someone like me can't even get in the door, or where, Corinne, you can't get in the door, right? I was saying the types of openness that we take for granted here in this room does not exist everywhere else. So, a push for open standards, and, governments can help in that regard. They're very large procurers of technology systems, and giving preference to open standards and ones that have, more minimal intellectual property restrictions and that are openly published and where people can participate. I mean, I can go on and on about this. The Global Commission on Internet Governance had some specific recommendations and discussion of the problem in the report that came out a couple of weeks ago. But I think the tampering with the infrastructure at the governance level is what I would worry about the most.
Hi there, my name is Andrew Sullivan. I'm going to avoid taking a position on the various things that you said, but you can take it as read that much of it I agree with. But this is, after all, the protocol, Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group, and that implies, for me at least, that there's a certain practical question that we need to be answering, and that is, what effect should these considerations have on what we're doing? And I'm wondering if maybe there's a distinction that you might want to make between things that are really cases where protocol design decisions could affect the outcome, and cases where there's not much we can do about it. There isn't anything I can do about that I can do in a protocol design about another standards development organization's bizarre policies around being closed, except of course to write a better protocol than they make, and then have mine deployed all over the place, which is actually what the IETF has managed to do. This is true, right? We have received, in fact, I will tell you this as a little anecdote. At one point, we received a communication from one of these closed groups over email about how we ought to be preferring their stuff, and it was this fantastic irony that we received this communication over the IETF's protocol that was supposedly so much inferior. When I look at some of these, it seems to me we are responding actually to a number of them. To pick on the DNS example, because it's one with which I'm very familiar, we invented DNSSEC precisely so that when people start tampering with it this way, you can detect that, and you can take measures to protect yourself. And we've adopted the DNS privacy efforts, for instance, in order to reduce the leakage that cause these kinds of things and so on. So what practical things do you want us to do with this list? Because that would be, I think, very helpful in guiding the discussion here in the research group. Thank you.
Right, and I had my computer muted. Could you say your name one more time? I just muted it at the very beginning.
My name is Andrew Sullivan, but that
oh yes,
doesn't
Andrew.
matter.
Right. yeah, I thought it was you. The screen that I'm looking at is very, very small. Hi, Andrew. I think you answered the question very well in your response, right? So DNS privacy is a perfect example of that, and other kinds of efforts to have strong encryption, pushing back against efforts to weaken encryption. So the DNS privacy is a perfect example of that. There are other cases that are not as obvious, and I think that when we get into later discussions in this session, there'll be more specific examples. And the only other thing I would say is, and I'll ask it as a question, what are opportunities to expand into other areas of standardization that are now at the margins of the core internet protocols? But as the internet is moving into objects and moving into things that are not content related, what are the opportunities to increase standardization so that there can be the multiple competing products, so that there can be interoperability, so that there can be the possibility of people like Corinne, for example, looking and studying the standards in an open way. So I would say expanding into areas that are on the margins now, and things that are privacy related are the two most obvious things that jump to mind.
I would like to urge you to keep it very short because our next speaker only has 20 minutes. So if it's a really urgent
list.
Yeah, let's take it to the list. Thank you very much, Andrew. And on that point, I would like to really thank Laura to take the time and also being a great inspiration with all her work. And I hope we can continue to work together. Thanks so much, Laura.
Thank you very much.
And on that point, I would like to continue to our next speaker. And that speaker is David Kay, who is the UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of expression, and who is also a clinical professor of law at the University of California in Irvine School of Law. Hi, David. Welcome to the Hrpc Research Group.
Hi, Niels. Can you hear me okay?
Not very okay. You're breaking up a bit.
Let's see. Maybe I'll disable video and see how that works.
Ooh.
Is this,
there is an echo in there. You might need to mute.
Is this any better?
No, it's not much better. Could you mute? Could you mute your speaker? Is it that perhaps?
No, I don't have a speaker. I just have. Well, let's see if I. Is it any better if I do this?
Could you try it again, David?
Here, how about this? Is this working any better for you?
Well, yeah. This is a lawyer showing a group of engineers how technology is troubleshooted. Thank you very much. Maybe you should be here next time. So, David, take it away. Go ahead.
Great. So I'm starting, and now I've got no video, and I have and I won't be able to hear you because I've muted. So hopefully this will all work out. This will all work out right. So I've only got a few minutes, which is unfortunate, and I would rather be over there with you because I think that I have a lot more to learn from you and from everybody in the room than you have to learn from me. I especially want to thank Laura for her presentation. I found that really fascinating. So I want to do a few things, and I hope that I'm not treading over ground that you've already dealt with in the past. But basically, I want to talk a little bit about freedom of expression and those standards, talk a little bit about my mandate with the Human Rights Council, and maybe share a little bit about the interests that I have, and offer a way for us to think about whether there's room for us to work together moving forward. And then just to highlight a couple of points about the projects that I'm working on and some ideas for collaboration. So in preparing for today, I mean, I did, and in preparing for my last report to the Human Rights Council, which was a mapping report on sort of private actors that are engaged in the internet and thinking about mapping that ecosystem for purposes of the Human Rights Council's understanding. And by Human Rights Council, I'm referring to the group of states that are in Geneva, basically, but the states that really sit at the center of the human rights universe in the UN system. I want to start first by talking about the standards for freedom of expression. So both, in my work and in the work of the Human Rights Council, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provide the standards for thinking about the restrictions that might be available to states, but most importantly, the rights that all individuals enjoy as a matter of freedom of expression. So the first is everyone enjoys the right to hold an opinion without interference. That includes protection against third parties, so it's also an issue of security. The freedom of expression at its core includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds through any media and regardless of frontiers. And I've always liked and really been amazed that the drafters of this provision included those two elements of regardless of frontiers and through any media, really identifying the sort of the internet well before the internet was invented, because this language comes from the 1940s. And then finally, the freedom of expression, and Article 19 in particular, provides that states may restrict freedom of expression, but not the right to opinion, where necessary and proportionate to achieve legitimate objectives such as public order, national security, the rights of others, and a couple of other points. So I report to the UN Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly on these issues. My predecessor reported on surveillance and on other internet issues. I myself have reported to the Human Rights Council on issues of encryption and anonymity, in particular how encryption and anonymity are essential elements for the exercise of the freedom of expression in a digital age. So we, meaning my mandate, I myself, and the IETF, obviously have a very neat overlap of interests, in as much as the internet has as its core the central value of allowing people to communicate with one another. And my mandate from the United Nations is protecting that very right in accordance with fundamental elements of human rights law. So my current project, the one that I introduced to the Human Rights Council last month, maps the ways in which the private ICT sector implicates freedom of expression. That report, which I think that Niels may have circulated, it highlights not only the roles played by the corporate actors themselves, but also the academic and technical communities involved in setting protocol and other standards within internet architecture. To date, we've emphasized our concern about the pressures that governments put on internet actors. And this was one of the last slides that Laura showed a few moments ago. And this is obviously through bulk collection, through surveillance, through takedown requests and requirements, through shutdowns of services, networks, and platforms, et cetera. So far, our work has not made specific recommendations to corporate actors or to others, but we have emphasized the importance of two main principles. So one is transparency, and that's important so that users understand the nature of rights and the nature of the security that they might enjoy online. And second, the importance of due diligence. And that's important so that all actors conduct careful reviews of products and standards to ensure compliance with, or advancement of freedom of expression and other human rights. I'd say that I'm especially concerned that private entities should integrate commitments to freedom of opinion and expression into internal policymaking, product engineering, business development, staff training, and other relevant internal processes. But to date, we haven't really drilled down into any of those particular principles, and that's what we're starting. And we've started this work, and over the course of the next 9 months or so, our first kind of focused project is going to deal with the telecommunications industry, ISPs, and equipment providers. We've been increasingly alarmed by the takedowns of such services or the requirements imposed on them. So there's a real focus here on government behavior, but the private actors themselves also obviously play a role, whether in the context of transparency and due diligence or in the technical work that's done to alleviate the problems posed by government requirements. I think that some of the Q&A and that was following and some of the chat room discussion during Laura's presentation emphasized a point that I think is really relevant, which is to what extent are these technical problems that the technical community can play a role in resolving and protecting, and to what extent are they policy level problems that governments are going to they're going to do what they want regardless. And clearly, just looking out at the environment, the policy environment over the last couple of years, in addition to those issues of encryption and security, we're increasingly, at least I'm increasingly seeing legislation that's typically under the framework of cybersecurity that really causes me some concern, and probably many in the room some concern about the security of networks and platforms, about the ability of government to collect individual data in ways that undermine sort of the privacy and freedom of expression standards that have been at the heart of the internet up until recently, really. So for this group, I think just to close on a few points, and maybe we have a few minutes for Q&A, I want to especially emphasize the following just few points. So the first one is that we, or I should say, I and my colleagues working on freedom of expression are not really out to regulate IETF or other technical standards making bodies. I believe strongly in a multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance that underlies the internet's governance. And part of that governance, I think, is ensuring technical standards that work for connectivity and communication without hindrance. Obviously, you not only share that goal, that's built into the work that you do, and I don't think there's a need for your work to be so regulated. And in fact, I think regulation would be the wrong direction. And connected to that is the second point, which is that I believe that the core values of the internet and of IETF in particular will be challenged as governments seek to undermine multi-stakeholderism as a matter of internet governance. This we've seen clearly in the context of efforts to bring internet regulation to the ITU and to other fora, and I think we need to be ahead of that process. So to the extent that you can align your technical goals with fundamental human rights standards and build those rights into technology, we're both achieving our shared objectives. In the absence of such clearly stated shared objectives, I'm afraid that there will be countervailing pressures on the technical community, on the human rights community, and on others. This is my final point, and I see that I may be breaking up here. I hope that you can hear me. In any event, this is my last point, and I think this is the obvious point that I'm not a technologist. It's been heartening to see technologists take up rights, and I want to urge you to do so explicitly, to really carefully assess technical standards for their compliance with human rights legal norms. So with that, I'll say thank you, and to say I'm sorry if I was garbled there.
Thanks, David. I'm not sure if you hear me right now, but if you could repeat your last 2 points in a non-garbled way, let's see if the connection gods allow us to see that. Could you please do so?
Yeah. Okay, I'll try again here. So the first point, it says, and I'm back and better. Okay, thanks. So the first point I was saying was that my projects are not out to regulate the IETF. I would say it's really important to me to learn from you, to learn the extent to which there's overlap and there's possibility for the IETF and your standard setting to integrate human rights standards in some technological way. And I know, Niels, you've been doing a lot of that work already. The 2 points that I think were garbled maybe they were just garbled by nature. But the first one was that I believe the core values of the internet and IETF will be challenged as governments seek to undermine multi-stakeholderism. So my view is that we need to be ahead of that process. We need to be ahead of the process that I think will end up in the ITU and may be very problematic. So to the extent that you're able to align your technical goals with fundamental human rights standards and build those rights into technology, we're both achieving shared objectives. And in the absence of such clearly stated objectives, I'm afraid that there will be countervailing pressures on the technical community. And then my last point was that I'm not a technologist, as I think you know, and is probably clear from my remarks. It's been heartening for me to see technologists take up rights, and I want to urge you to do so explicitly, to really carefully assess technical standards for their compliance with human rights legal norms. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We already had an applause for you, but you might not have heard it, so maybe we could just repeat. And I know you need to catch a train in 5 minutes. So if people have questions, it will be great if they queue up now. And in the meantime, while people are queuing up, I got a question for you, and that is, how do you think the IETF could inform your work in the coming 9 months, and how do you see that? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm glad you asked it. So, I mean, what I would really like to do. So, there's a couple of ways in which we can engage in a kind of dialogue. So, as I mentioned in my remarks, we're starting our project of drilling down into this space by focusing on telcos, ISPs, and NEPs, and it would be extremely helpful for us to have the technology input as we're seeking to develop an understanding of both the government pressure on this sector of the ICT industry, but also the ways in which technology might actually be built to protect freedom of expression and to protect privacy at that level. So we'll be issuing calls for submissions. One of the ways we work when we do our projects is that we seek submissions from experts, from civil society, from others. And I know, Niels, you'll be alive to this and ready for this, and we'll make sure that you see them. But if you can circulate to people our call for submissions, so that, you know, technologists and the IETF in particular, if you have input, you know, we would really benefit from that.
I will make sure that gets circulated on the Hrpc list and also forwarded to IETF and IETF. There is someone in the queue. Please, could you state your name and ask your question?
Hi, my name is Ben Schwartz, and I work for Jigsaw, formerly known as Google Ideas. I'm wondering what the harbingers that you've observed are of this pressure that we fear might appear against the IETF and its participants. Could you give any examples of things that have caused you to worry about this?
So thanks for that question. So, I mean, when I'm referring to there is in the context of the ITU, and you know, it's very clear that governments, you know, in particular Russia and China, but several others, are interested in imposing a different kind of internet governance, internet governance that isn't multi-stakeholder, but that is much more directed towards government regulation. And my fear is that that kind of regulation will actually put real pressure on technologists in terms of the kind of internet infrastructure that exists, and it would be a kind of pressure that is contrary to human rights norms. So that's, I mean, that's my concern. I mean, I think that's why it's so important for technologists to stay involved in these discussions. But that's, if I understood your question correctly, I mean, I hope that I'm being responsive. That's the nature of my concern on the governance side.
Thank you.
Charles Neville, the flip side question. When should we as technologists say, stop trying to set policy for the rest of the world? This is a question that countries and societies are entitled to determine for themselves. And, you know, and when is something a question where, no, this is actually a universal human right, which we are upholding, you know, by enforcing in our technical decisions particular political approaches or preferencing particular political outcomes.
So, I mean, that's the kind of question that we address all the time I mean, generally in sort of trying to identify when human rights norms apply and when national norms and interests and needs apply. And I mean, it's, from my perspective, the core value from the get-go of the creation of the internet was creating space for connectivity and communication, and that's perfectly in line with the standards of freedom of expression and human rights law. And so, you know, my view is that it's critical for for networks to be responsive to that freedom of expression, and to be based on universal values and not on, you know, local or national values. I mean, if we go the direction of local or national values, I think we're talking about, you know, a walled off internet, and we're talking about an internet where rights generally are not respected. So I hope that's responsive to that. Unfortunately, I have to run to catch a train. But again, I wanted to thank Niels for inviting me. I hope that the next time this group meets, I could actually meet with you and get more reactions to the kind of points that I've raised today. But I want to thank you for at least listening. And I'm pretty accessible through email or Twitter. And if you want to raise issues with me, please do so. I'd really like to hear from you.
Thank you very much, David, for being here and being so approachable. And we are definitely looking forward to potentially see you in Seoul. Thank you very much, David. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
And that brings us from two more high-level speakers back to very concrete examples of work here at the IETF. And for that, I'd like to invite Alyssa. There is Alyssa. To tell us a bit more about the process in RFC 6973. Alyssa, of which we based some of our work in a draft that we'll discuss after this. Alyssa is Distinguished Engineer at Cisco Systems and Arts Director here in the IETF. And you all know her. So, Alyssa, please go ahead.
Thanks. Let's see, do you have my deck? Oh, good. Yeah, so as Neil said, I'm one of the co-authors, or I guess as the editor of RFC 6973. Could I just see a show of hands? How many people have read or skimmed RFC 6973? Okay, some people have, okay. So in a past life, I used to work for a civil liberties advocacy organization on privacy and free expression, and started coming to the IETF to work on those things. So this was, for me, was something that grew out of that privacy work that I was doing in other parts of the IETF. And this is the document that from the Internet Architecture Board that provides some guidance to protocol designers about how to consider privacy in their protocol specifications. So Niels wanted me to talk a little bit about lessons learned from that process as a means to think about how they might apply to the work of this group. So why did we write RFC 6973? Going back some years now, there were a bunch of us who were sitting around thinking about privacy as a concept, as a design construct. And if you look at the history in the IETF, we thought that there were some pretty strong parallels with the way that security is considered. So in the olden times, there wasn't a lot of rigor around how security was considered in protocol design. And then sort of over time, as certain individuals and then groups of people started to realize that, hey, maybe we should think about like, how do we secure this protocol? Because there's all these attacks and that's not good. And we should probably, have more of a systematic way of thinking about these things. People started to write RFCs that created some structure around how we think about security in the IETF. And so there's a bunch listed there that talk about different things, what you need to put in your draft, what kinds of crypto standards we use. There's a bunch of different documents that give guidance now. And so at this point, realistically, you can't really design some new protocol in the IETF without a fairly solid and complete story about how to secure that protocol, or a fairly solid and complete story about why, for some reason, you don't have to secure it. And so what we were hoping to do with the privacy considerations was to essentially build on top of that and to extend that framework and that line of thinking to privacy considerations, some of which have overlap with the security ones that were already addressed, and some of which do not. So then the question is, well, how did we write this document? It began as an informational individual internet draft that a bunch of folks, not including myself, had written. We sort of took that and tried to build off of the structure that already existed in RFC 3552, which is basically the equivalent document for security. Eventually, the IAB's, what was the privacy program, what's now the IAB's PrivSec program, took this document up and thought, hey, this is kind of an architectural matter that really cuts across many of the areas of the IETF and of internet engineering overall. So it seems like a fodder for the IAB. So it's taken on by the IAB, and then through some more years of work, it eventually was published in 2013. So it's about 3 years from start to finish. Many discussions in various venues, lots of, as you would expect from any document in the IETF, but it was published in the IAB stream, which means that it doesn't have the consensus of the IETF. That's how IAB stream documents work, but it's published on behalf of the IAB as a means to provide guidance to the community if they want to pay attention, or sometimes they don't, and then they don't pay attention to it. So I just wanted to go through a couple of what I remember as being kind of the tricky points. I called them hard-fought decisions. They weren't all hard-fought, but they were important decisions that we had to make in terms of deciding things to figure out if we were ever actually going to get this document done. And so there's a bunch of those. The first that I have characterized as limited ambition, but general applicability. So there's a bunch of things that we decided not to do in this document because we thought that if we did try to take them on, we would potentially discuss them forever and never finish, or that we just didn't really think there was like a single solution that made any sense to recommend or to define. So there's no single definition of privacy in this document. There are no explicit prohibitions, nor are there any specific requirements. So there's nothing in this document that says you must do X or you must not do X. It just provides some general guidance. It does not require every IETF RFC to have a privacy consideration section because we thought there's such a variety of different kinds of technologies being developed here that that would not always be appropriate. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's part of security considerations, sometimes the whole document is about privacy. So we didn't want to mandate some more boilerplate that half the time was going to get ignored or that people were going to feel like was a burden when it wasn't applicable. And it makes reference to no specific legal framework. And that was super important because obviously we are very much a global body. We want the work that happens in the IETF to be usable anywhere. And so we didn't want to sort of hamstring ourselves by being tied to any specific legal framework or definition. The document is very explicit in acknowledging the scope limitations of its own guidelines. So we know that what we do here is build building blocks. We do not build entire systems. We do not, at least as an organization, we don't implement things or deploy things ourselves. And so we perfectly acknowledge that there's a limitation to how much you can actually accomplish from a privacy perspective if all you're doing is standardizing the bits on the wire. There's implementation considerations, there's deployment, there's operations, and those are, we can influence them through protocol design, but a lot of that is out of the control of what happens within the bounds of the IETF, and that we thought was important to acknowledge. We also thought it was important to acknowledge that there's different potential opportunities depending on which layer of the stack your protocol is targeting, or really just what it does, right? So if you're going to talk about creating hooks for user interface or something like that, that's probably a little more applicable at the application layer than it is at some of the lower layers. So it's important to kind of be specific in terms of which layer of the stack you're targeting. A couple of other things we had to decide. For a while, we're kind of muddy between things that protocols should not do, that are sort of negative recommendations. If you don't want to leak or create the opportunity to fingerprint, here are things that you shouldn't do, and things that are actually privacy enhancing and that can be considered privacy features. And so over time, we ended up making a fairly explicit distinction between when we were talking about one or the other, and that I think was quite useful. And then the other thing that we thought was really important was to provide specific examples of the guidelines. So there's one very long worked example in the document, which is about presence. And then throughout, there's examples in other places where we try to point to specific protocols and features to illustrate, well, here's how you could actually exercise this principle or that principle. So if you write an RFC in a forest, does anybody read it? We published the document, as I said, in 2013, but publishing a document, especially in the IAB stream, doesn't necessarily get you a whole lot if nobody pays attention to it. So how do you get people to pay attention to it? How are we going to get people to care? Just the mere publication of the document was never going to be enough to try and affect the behavior of protocol designers in the IETF. So there are a bunch of different things we tried to try and raise awareness and increase the visibility of privacy in general and this document specifically, and some of them worked for some definition of work and some of them did not work. So one thing we did pretty soon after the publication was we had some tutorials. We did one with the working group chairs. We did a couple on the Sunday before the IETF meeting. I think we recorded one that we posted online so that anybody could see it, which basically walked people through the content of the document and explained what it was that we were trying to, that we were asking people to do and think about as they were doing their work in the IETF. So that, I think, we got good feedback that those were useful. We tried to set up a privacy directorate. So I don't know how familiar people are with the directorate structure, but this is meant to be a kind of formal group to which would have been delegated reviews of documents as they move through the IETF process towards the end of the process, where a reviewer would be assigned, and that person would be responsible for doing a review of the document from a privacy perspective and calling out issues that they flagged or that they thought were of concern or that where improvements could be made, calling those out to the area director as the document was moving through the process, or the shepherd, to try and get those fixed. And this didn't work because the most successful directorates that we have are quite well organized. They have some sort of secretarial function where the reviews get handed out on a regular basis, and people take their responsibility seriously, and the reviews come in at the right time, and all of this. And we never really got steam behind that kind of structure in the privacy directorate. So it's not that we couldn't ever again, but that's what happened when we tried. There's other kind of activities and ideas that have been floating around, some of which are in progress now, that are related to this. So there was an effort as well to do privacy reviews of old RFCs. So this was after the disclosures about pervasive surveillance. There were a bunch of people who wanted to kind of take a look back at things that we had published previously and try to do a comprehensive privacy review. And that went on for a little while, but I think also eventually kind of petered out. We have successfully added, I think, some privacy expertise as a criteria for the IESG, for the technical leadership of the IETF. So now we basically say, it would be nice if we have a couple of area directors at any one time who have some depth of expertise in privacy. We are talking about possibly incorporating bits of RFC 6973 into the next revision of 3552, which would have a normative status and be on the standards track, I think, or be in BCP or something informational. And there, I believe, are people who are going to do a refresh of the tutorial. So potentially in Seoul, there will be an updated version of the tutorial that's given. So those kind of some like institutional things that we did to try to raise awareness about privacy in the IETF. So what happened? Did it work? So there's like one little wrinkle in the ability, in our ability to assess whether, what the impact was of RFC 6973, and that has to do with this guy. So we published he published his revelations in June of 2013, and we published our document in July of 2013. So basically what that means is that in the ensuing time, any kind of increased awareness about privacy or the fact that people suddenly have so much energy to work on privacy for the DNS and for DHCP and for IPv6 and for every protocol that is under the sun. Who knows if that had to do with our document or if that had to do with him. But I can tell you what happened. And this is really just like, this is what it looks like to me as someone who has to read every document before it gets published. So I think that privacy awareness has increased among people who come and do work at the IETF. I think that is demonstrated in many, many documents that arrive at the IESG for IESG evaluation. Not all documents, but many documents. So I've been pretty pleasantly surprised that even when we spot issues, and this is like really late in the process, right? So we, as area directors, we still spot issues that we think can be fixed. Sometimes documents get stuck for a long time at this tail end of the process because of privacy concerns. But I think, I can really see that people are trying, that people from a wide variety of areas have been exposed to this notion that this is something they need to think about. And so even if it's not all the way there, they don't have a complete solution by the time the document comes to us. I can tell that there's wider knowledge and appreciation of this than there used to be. And then of course there are all those very tailored specific efforts to make privacy protections better in specific protocols. So there's a specific checklist in 6973. This really, it's not like a checklist, but it's like questions that we posed for protocol designers to think through. That whole list itself is very rarely used in its entirety, as far as I can tell, or as far as is reflected in the document. So if you look at 7594, which is a measurement document, maybe one of whose authors is scurrying out of the room, I think, right, Phil? Is that your document?
Sure.
You and Al did the document for in IPPM, right? Or in it was an LMAP, yeah. So anyway. Thank you, Phil. So they actually went through like the whole questionnaire, and they have a whole section in their document that is responsive to each question in the questionnaire. That is very unusual, right? We don't get a lot of that, but occasionally we do. So I will say though that attention to privacy consideration is still certainly dependent on who the people are who are involved. So who are the authors, which last call reviewers actually paid attention, or which sector reviewer, or which AD was on vacation that week or whatever. So there's still things that we are certainly missing, and there's still certainly a lot of improvement to do overall in the protocol stack, but we're seeing improvement. So that's kind of in terms of standardization. I think the other thing that we've seen, which is not, directly correlated, but there's certainly increased deployment in privacy-friendly technologies and encrypted traffic on the internet and so on. And that, again, I would not attribute to RFC 6973, but it has happened in the meantime anyway. So what does this mean for human rights protocol considerations more broadly? These are just a few thoughts that I had in reading through Niels's draft, so take them for what they're worth. And this is really informed by the 6973 process. So the first thing that I would think about doing if I had to do this was to focus on one area at a time. I think for people who are not accustomed to thinking about these things, for people who are really not convinced that technical protocol actually has properties that implicate human rights, taking a giant list of things and saying, well, here's all you have to think about is actually very daunting and is much easier to shoot down than if it's something that's kind of tailored and precise and says, here's like one new area where like we see gaps in the work that the IETF is doing, and here's some suggestions for how to fix that. I mean, privacy is large, but it's smaller than the set of things. It's it's just one part of human rights, right? So that I think is maybe a way to achieve incremental success as opposed to trying to boil the ocean. The other thing I would say is to focus on areas that are truly currently lacking in guidance. So one thing I noticed in the document is that it talks a lot about principles and properties that are pretty well trod in the IETF, anonymity and lots of security related topics, internationalization, right? So to the extent that there already exists guidance in other IETF documents or just in the kind of mind share that we have here, it's probably not worth spending too much time on those because people will feel that it's duplicative. If you can just point someone to 3552, then really what else do you need to say about security considerations? Obviously 3552 needs some updates, but that, notwithstanding. Provide specific examples. So this was super useful when we were doing 6973, and I think, if you really want to get people to change the text of their document or to change the design of their protocol in some way, you need to be able to explain, like, we have this value around censorship or around decentralization. Let me show you how, here's the way protocol X was designed such that it facilitated censorship, and here's a change that could have been made to improve that. Those kinds of things, make it concrete for people and just help them understand what is it that you want me to do when I read this document and apply it to the work that I'm doing. And then lastly, I would just say to be specific about the scope limitations. Again, like what we do here is building blocks. You're not going to be able to solve everything in an IETF standard. You might not be able to solve very much because so much is left up to how the pieces are put together, how systems are built, how they get deployed, how they get operated. And that's okay. That we acknowledge that all the time for other reasons. And it's okay to acknowledge that for this reason as well. And also to the earlier point about kind of upper layers versus lower layers, there's just some of these things that are, make a whole lot more sense. Internationalization, right? Like much more of an upper layer concern than a lower layer concern sometimes. Maybe that wasn't the best example, but you see what I'm saying. If you can kind of focus your guidance in the place where it's most likely to have an impact, then people will be more likely to take it seriously. So that is all I had. Happy to take questions if people have any.
It's Pete Resnick. So I was looking at the list. I've been having a conversation sort of offline as this is going on. For security, privacy, internationalization, the first and last being the easiest ones, I've got very easy ways to construct those not as human rights issues, but as protocol issues. And not that they're not human rights issues, but I've got a way to keep them in the protocol layers and not commit the layer violation of going into the human world. And privacy, I can pretty much do that. That is, I can say for security, if there is bad security, then there's going to be places where the protocol doesn't perform well, or if there's no internationalization, there's going to be interoperability problems because I can't transfer these kinds of characters or represent these kinds of human languages that I need to within the protocol. And I'm wondering if that's sort of a good principle to go on, that we pick principles that apply to the protocol that have human rights implications, but that can be viewed only in the protocol layers as simple, clean protocol principles, not human rights principles. And so I was looking at censorship resistance and thinking, that sounds like not a protocol principle, but universal accessibility, interoperability seems like a good protocol principle. And so being able to have universal addressability, being able to be end-to-end, because that will accomplish not being able to get something in the middle blocked, sort of like switching the language to make those principles available.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I think I probably should have included that in the hard-fought decision slide. Like, that's something that came up actually a lot with 6973. In particular, one debate that we had for a long time before settling on what's in the document now was whether to adopt the threat modeling language and paradigm from security, right? Should we call privacy attacks attacks? Should we call the entity who obtains data that we don't want them to have an attacker? Right? And we decided yes, because this is familiar language. Even if it made us a little bit, it always makes you a little bit uncomfortable to say, oh, my ISP is my attacker. We decided to go with it because we thought it was familiar enough to people that they would be able to grasp it. And so I think that's a really good suggestion.
Even though it's a great discussion, we only have 15 minutes left, and we still have 3 presenters and a concrete draft to discuss. So sorry, Alyssa, but I hope that we can also take comments from here while discussing the actual draft, so we can actually really take the lessons from 6973 into the actual work. Thank you very much, Alyssa. And here I have to make a little remark, is that because I am one of the authors of the draft, I would like you to be extra critical, to really sure to there is no seeming of me trying to game the system, but I probably don't have to tell you that.
I love how Niels just told you to be critical as I step in front of the mic. And I'm now even more intimidated than I was. Any kind of jumbling of myself will be the result of that, trying to hold these two things and a slight overdose of Club Mate. So excuse me in advance. I'll try and go through this quite quickly. What we try to do is a recap of the discussion we've been having on the mailing list, so you can see what the updates have been to the draft. So I can skip through these and go straight down. So basically there's 4 categories of changes we've made. The first being the obvious, the typos and whatnot. Then the second, talking about the research methodology and a potential test to sort of lay out how exactly we think that protocols can impact human rights. The third being the mapping of protocols that impact human rights that we've done. And the last one being the guidelines and the questionnaire. Now, you can see that there has been a lot of discussion and effort and man-hour and frustration that's gone into this. So the first thing, typos, formatting, citations, and Dutchism. What happens when you have 2 Dutch people writing or doing a lot of the editing of the document? Dutchisms. We hope we've taken most of them out, but if you happen to spot one, please feel free to reach out to me. So now to the meat of what we're discussing. Research methodology and testing. So there's been a very long discussion on the list regarding our research methodology, something that apparently we hadn't made clear, specifically how we went about doing this research, how we defined the human rights impact, and then we had a long discussion about creating a test to sort of give more boundaries as to what protocols would constitute potential human rights violators and which one wouldn't. This is something that's an ongoing discussion on the list. We haven't fully wrapped that up yet. So if anybody has any additional ideas or anything that you think that we might have missed, please do let us know, because it's an important ticket and we would like to close it eventually. So an example, well, I've just given you one, but something else that some of the language wasn't necessarily as clear as it could have been, so we try to clean that up a little bit more and add the additional reference where needed. So then the third thing, mapping of protocols that impact human rights. For those who've read the draft, and just for humor's sake, I'm going to assume everybody has.
Because everybody does.
We actually name a whole bunch of different cases of examples to clarify what we're trying to get at here. And because this was written by different people from different backgrounds, it means that looking at the document as a whole, it wasn't always as clear as it should have been. So what we tried to do was actually mostly improve the language, make sure that it reads more smoothly and as one document. And then something that was absolutely crucial to improving the document is that we got 4 reviews of people who were testing it in the wild. So I want to give a big shout out to James Gannon, to Harry Halpin, to Shane Kerr, sitting right there, and Giovanni Mora, whose work really, really made a difference. And at the same time, I also want to call upon you guys and girls, if there's anybody here who's developing something and you think you would, want to try something and try and see how our guidelines apply to what you're working on, that would be great. We welcome that. Come and talk to Niels or me afterwards. And then the last bit is also streamlining. So I've already gone through the examples, so I can skip that. Great. So guidelines and questionnaires. This is what we've been talking about a lot. So for those who've seen the document, you see that at the end that there's sort of a questionnaire that has different questions about the protocol you're developing and what potential rights it impacts and what questions you can ask yourself about the work you're developing, especially for us to document it. So the main goal of this is for us to document so we have a clear overview and understanding of how your protocol could potentially impact human rights, whether positively or negatively. And on this, we've actually had a lot of positive feedback from the people who've done the actual tests. And what was really interesting for us to see is that the people who did the reviews actually ended up changing their work and saying, oh, I hadn't considered this potential impact. Let me make sure that my protocol does X, Y, or Z slightly different. And then there was some repetition in the text, which we try to reduce. This is also good to hear from Alyssa as well, that we need to make sure that we're not doing things that are redundant because they're either already covered in other RFCs or because our document does it twice. Now, next steps. Since the last meeting, we've had the extensive reviews before the adoption of the research group ID. We've had the extensive reviews by the various people I just mentioned. And so almost all issues seem resolved. However, we're always happy to take your comments and suggestions. It will only make the document better. So the schedule that we're proposing right now is we want to do 1 more month of review, comments, suggestions, etc., and that'll give us some time to rework the comments made here and then perhaps do a last call. I suggest that maybe we move on to the next presenters, and if there's any questions about this, we do it later or we bunch them together because I want to give them the opportunity to speak as well, seeing as they put so much work into this.
Thank you very much, Corinne. We will call you back to the microphone later after we hear from the testers, namely first Shane Kerr.
Great, short people. All right, thank you. You're Dutch, you're supposed to be tall. What's going on? So
stereotypes.
Yeah, at the last IETF, Niels called for people to use the guidelines, and I volunteered. So we are working on a draft of a protocol which is DNS over HTTP. It's basically we're tunneling one protocol over another. It's a complete hack, but it can be useful. So I went through our document and I went through the guidelines, and my observations are that it is indeed basically a useful set of checklists. And I thought actually Alyssa's comments were very interesting because there were a lot of them, and I think the idea of having fewer of them makes a lot of sense, and picking up small pieces to chew and so on. Because it was actually a lot of different areas to think about. And it ended up me having to go through my documents several times. It was also an unprioritized list, which made it hard to know where to get started. So I just kind of started at .1 and ended up at .45 or whatever it was. So I know since I've done this work, a couple of the points have been removed, and I think there may have been clarifying text for some others. I haven't reviewed the latest version of the recommendations, sorry. But I mean, a few things that did stand out was that in the document, there wasn't any kind of suggestion about where you should go to for input. If you had, for example, privacy questions, which I did, and that was discussed on lists. So I assume the document will get updated and that will be helpful. I was confused about a couple of sections, and I admit I'm still a little confused about heterogeneity and adaptability. And a few of the sections I considered that seemed to me to be very, very similar or even just complete duplicates. And I think a couple of those have been removed, but probably not others. So that's it. All the feedback was sent to the list, and there's been some discussion. And I'll have a look at the final changes. And I haven't actually done all the work because I have to do a lot of work documenting our privacy concerns, which was discovered by going through this list. So that was good. That's it.
Thanks, Shane. Now over to Giovanni, who was also nice enough to do some road testing.
All right, so same thing. This is our draft. This is a DOTS draft. It's, and I'm just a rough author there, so we're in this draft. This is a very initial version right now, so there's a good and bad things about it. The good things is a great point to start to think about all those human rights implications. The bad thing, it's like some things are not that clear yet, so you don't know how it's going to look like in the future. I also have to say that's my fourth IETF. I came from academia, and so there's also pros and cons here. There's a lot of things that this draft really helped me out in here. In our draft, basically what it does is just a backend follow-up mechanism, fallback to signaling mechanism for DDoS attacks. So if you have a router under attack, you're going to signal it back to another server in the network that has been under attack, which means it does not handle like user data. I think that is an important thing. It's just machine to machine. So I enumerate here the most relevant items of the questionnaire or questions. Some are more or less relevant. I'm not going to go into the specifics, and others are not directly relevant. But one of the things I had in the discussion is that since our draft covers machine-to-machine communication, so it doesn't handle directly user data, some questions are not pertinent or not related, like I said here. But I don't think it's always the case. For example, if you think of BGP, it doesn't necessarily handle users' data, but it can really be used on censorship. So I don't have an answer in here. It's just something came when I was doing this analysis. I have a couple of takeaways. So I think it helps a lot who is writing the IETFers who are writing the RFCs or drafts to question their implicit values. Because I didn't know that, but once I had to go to the ethics commission during my PhD, I realized that I had a lot of values that I put on my filtering mechanism, my thesis, whatever. And they were just a given for me, so I had to question those. And I think it happened the same with this document here when I was doing this review. So we actually had a draft, and if you're interested, that's the URL for what happened. I wrote a paper with an ethicist on that. It was a very interesting exercise. As Shannon also said, it's a great checklist. That's great. And it's a win-win situation. So if you review it, you're going to have a better draft technically. So that's also, it's a way to incentivize IETFers to use this. It's not clear yet what are going to change in our draft. That's one of the questions that Niels had, because it's in the early stages. We have a really core problems also to fix on that, but definitely it's going to change something. And one thing that also Shane also mentioned is like it takes a lot of time and effort to go for all those questions in the questionnaire. So if it would be simpler or somehow more effective, it would be help. And I think that's it.
Thanks so much, Giovanni. That's really great. And I would like to thank you very much, Shane and Giovanni, for taking the extra time while working on your draft to look at this. I'm cognizant that we officially only have 2 minutes left for this session, which is not enough to properly discuss this draft. So even though I would really like to invite your queuing, your questions and your comments here, I would also really like to ask you to send them to the list. But also I would like to get a bit the temperature of the room, whether the proposed schedule, like going for 1 more month for suggestions and then going into last call, would be okay.
So this is Shane Kerr again. In principle, that seems reasonable, but it is summer, of course, so you may want to stretch it a little bit.
Joe Hall, CDT. Is the IRTF process different than the IETF process? I don't know.
Yeah, in the IRTF we can. Oh, there is Lars at the mic.
Lars Eckert, yes, the process is different because there isn't really a process. Each research group can decide what works best for them and run with it.
And up to now, we said because this is an important draft that we think influence the community, and we really want to take the whole community in the process, it has most clarity if we follow the IETF rules. So that's what we're going to do. Last call doesn't mean that it's cut off. So if people do not have serious problems with that, I think we will go ahead with this proposed way. I would like to quickly get a hum on that. Like, are people okay with the proposed schedule of having 1 month open for suggestions and changes, and then when they are resolved, going for last call? So if you agree, please hum now. If you do not agree, please hum now. Okay, well, that is clear. There's still work to be done. We'll do that on list. Thank you very much for your time, your attention, and caring about this topic, and looking forward to see you on the list and in Seoul. Bye all. Hi, could you stay here for a second? Look at my laptop and I'll head to the phone. Start